Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Election years have a way of pushing people to think big picture about the state of our country, the state of democracy, the state of us. Today on the pod, we've got two writers who can help guide us through those big picture questions. In a bit, we'll hear from Timothy Snyder. He's a historian and a specialist in Eastern and Central European history. You might be familiar with his 2017 book On Tyranny, which chronicled the rise of tyranny and how we might prevent it. He's got a follow-up now titled On Freedom, about the ways we define freedom. But first, Stanford professor Jamil Zaki has this interesting book called Hope for Cynics. It's a science-based, data-backed argument against cynicism, which he defines as thinking most people are selfish and greedy. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little defensive listening to the first part of this interview because as a reporter, I just think that it's safe to assume most people have ulterior, self-serving motivations. But as he points out in this interview with Here and Now's Deepa Fernandes, there is a difference between cynicism and skepticism. That's ahead.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from the Southern Environmental Law Center and its podcast, Broken Ground. Picture the rural South, and country stores and fields of farmland may come to mind. But what about landfills, strip mines? All over the South, polluting industries are courting small towns, betting what they do there will be out of sight and out of mind. This season on Broken Ground, dig into what happens when small-town neighbors decide to fight for a better future. Now available wherever you listen to podcasts.
You may remember hearing Stanford professor Jamil Zaki on Here and Now talking about empathy and how developing it, even for those with whom we have profound disagreements, can alter conflicts, deepen relationships, even create better health outcomes. Well, now the professor is tackling an even more intractable topic, cynicism, and how its rise might be eroding society. In case you're thinking, well, why should I care? Consider this. Cynics experience more loneliness and depression and have lower incomes. They die earlier. And on the world stage, cynicism ushers in dictators, oppresses minorities, and divides societies. Sounds pretty grim, right? But as Jamil Zaki will be the first to say, there are reasons to be hopeful. His new book is Hope for Cynics. It's part science, part memoir, and part tribute to the friend who pulled him out of his own cynicism and taught him the value of hope, even as he was dying of brain cancer. And I welcome Jamil Zaki back to Here and Now. Jamil, hello.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Jamil, I really enjoyed your book, and in a sense it documents your own journey to understand your own cynicism, and it uses research and interviews and conversations and anecdotes, but it really all wraps around the story of a friend of yours, Emil, who inspired this book. Tell us a little bit about him.
Emil was a friend of mine and one of my heroes. He was a peace neuroscientist. He used tools from neuroscience to understand why people fall into horrible conflict and to see if we could learn how to bring them back. He also lived a beautiful life and always saw the best in others. And he did that despite having faced enormous adversity. At the beginning of his life, his mother developed severe schizophrenia. And as you mentioned, at the end of his life, he was afflicted with brain cancer. And yet, despite all of these difficulties, Emil retained a fierce choice, which was to live his life seeing human potential.
Yeah, and his life story is woven throughout the book. I wonder if you can tell us, in terms of the book, how you define cynicism.
Cynicism is the general theory that most people are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. And if you feel that way about people, a lot of things change for you. You don't feel like trusting others. Trust is the willingness to be vulnerable to somebody else on the expectation that they have your best interest in mind. Well, if you're a cynic, that bet is for suckers. And we see all throughout the science that cynics trust less in economic games, but they also trust less in their personal lives. They trust public figures less, and they trust people in general less. So there's a really strong relationship between our views of what people are like and our willingness to be vulnerable to them.
You draw a distinction between cynicism and skepticism. You call Emil a hopeful skeptic. Hopeful? Explain that.
Some people who met Emil thought that he was naive because they thought the opposite of a cynic is a gullible person. But he was far from naive. He had seen hatred and pain on many different continents. Instead, he chose to evaluate each person and each situation on its own. That's what skepticism is. Skeptics are more like scientists. They seek out data. And it turns out that that view leaves room for lots of hope, because it turns out that most people are more trustworthy, more open-minded, and friendlier than we realize.
You make the case that cynicism isn't healthy. Cynics suffer more things like depression and loneliness. They drink more, they earn less, they die younger. Why?
One of the most nourishing psychological experiences we can have is feeling connected with other people. And that lowers our stress, helps us sleep better, helps us stay healthy in all sorts of ways.
You know, right about now, people might be wondering, well, what am I? Am I a cynic? And you have like some little activities in there to test where you fall. I have to say, both my producer Karen and I came up as very low in cynicism. But where do most people fall?
Cynicism is a spectrum, and most people fall on the low to medium end of that spectrum. I should add, I'm not one of those people. So for anybody who thinks I'm trying to convert cynics, actually, part of this book for me was an exploration of how I could overcome that. So there's a big range in where we fall, and we're becoming more cynical over time. So in 1972, about half of Americans believed most people can be trusted. By 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans, a huge drop.
You made the individual case, but as a community, as a society, that we're getting more cynical. Why does that matter?
Cynicism is poisonous to individuals, but I think it's just as poisonous to communities, whether those are families or companies or entire countries. So cynical communities tend to be less active. People, for instance, are less civically engaged if they don't trust their neighbors. Those communities are economically less well off, less likely to grow. And cynicism also opens us to things like extreme division, even authoritarianism. It turns out that cynical people who don't trust their fellow citizens are more open to so-called strongman leaders who promise to protect us from each other at the cost of our personal freedoms.
And you have some great real examples in the book of people who fall all over the place on this spectrum. I really appreciated the woman who fell down the QAnon rabbit hole. Her cynicism drove her to this conspiracy movement.
Megan is the name I use for her in the book, is a California progressive, not your stereotypical QAnon believer, but she had had a really difficult upbringing and, like me, actually, had a tendency to mistrust others. And that ballooned during the pandemic into a tendency to mistrust everything. And a friend shared with her some QAnon materials. And when we're feeling cynical, we'll go for any explanation that allows us to frame our suspicion as seeing behind the curtain, as having insight that other people don't have.
And I want to just return to something you said earlier, which is that extreme cynicism can lead to the rise of strong men leaders. Is that something you think we're seeing right now?
I do think that cynicism and populism relate to one another. So cynical people are more open to populist leaders. And on the other hand, populist leaders often work by spreading cynicism, mistrust in things like media and science and our fellow citizens. And again, a society that doesn't trust itself is much easier to control. So we think of cynicism sometimes as a radical worldview, but actually more often it's a tool of the status quo.
You know, I feel like I have to ask you because, you know, we think back to 2008 and Obama came to power on very powerful messaging that used hope. And then there were people who said, well, hope doesn't put food on my table. Hope doesn't educate my children really well. I can keep hoping, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's important to specify that hope is different from optimism. Optimism is the belief that the future will turn out well, so you can kind of just sit on your couch and wait for everything to come up roses. Hope is the idea that things could turn out well, and it turns out that it's a very active way of viewing the future that magnetizes us towards what we want through our actions.
I want to ask you about climate change because you have a really interesting example in the book about how corporations, you say, wield cynicism like a scalpel. You say, for example, that the petroleum giant BP invested millions of dollars into the concept of this thing called the carbon footprint. But what you point out is that that shifts the blame for climate change from corporations to individuals. Tell me how that came to be.
I was shocked to learn this as well, that this idea of a carbon footprint sounds really powerful, that we should all reduce our carbon emissions. I think that's true, by the way. But it was a marketing campaign by BP. And the idea was, look, if we act as though everyday people are to blame for climate change, then we can redirect attention from polluting giants that actually produce a ton of carbon emissions, while also lobbying against the types of policies that would allow each one of us to reduce our carbon footprint more easily. So it's a sort of shell game that points cynicism at each other as a way of deflecting from people who are actually causing the most harm.
And I love that you draw this back to Emil, which is where I want to end, because he, as you pointed out, was the kind of man who would take his own Tupperware when he went out to eat. Yet he would also take his children and go to a climate change protest. It wasn't one or the other. What do you want to leave us with from Emil's life that we can try and apply to our own lives?
I really think that we have glamorized cynicism as a form of strength, wisdom, and morality even. But Emil showed us through his incredible integrity and through his authenticity that actually being hopeful is more powerful in a number of ways. It's much more active, and it can help us discover what so many of us want. Human beings have much more in common in terms of our values than we realize. So when we stop applying stereotypes, cynical assumptions about each other, we discover so much in common and can start fighting for a better future by seeing it more clearly.
It feels like a little bit of a call to arms. Am I overreading you there?
Not at all. Martin Luther King gave a speech to the American Psychological Association, and he said, we shouldn't focus on whether people are happy, because in the face of bigotry and violence and inequality, we shouldn't always feel happy. We should feel what he called creative maladjustment. That is, a righteous fury against systems that harm people, but also a creative sense of hope, knowing that most people around us are better than that.
Stanford psychologist Jamil Zaki. His new book is called Hope for Cynics. Jamil, thank you so much.
This has been delightful. Thank you.
Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Learning. IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid no matter the age or personality. Get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when you sign up today at IXL.com/NPR. This message comes from Progressive Insurance, where drivers who switch could save hundreds on car insurance. Get your quote at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates.
I'm not going to say much setting up this next interview between NPR's Scott Simon and historian Timothy Snyder, talking about his book On Freedom. I'll just say something happens interrupting this interview, and it had me thinking deeply about the things in my life I take for granted. Here it is.
Russia will lose.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke in London's Westminster Hall last year.
We know freedom will win.
Yale historian Timothy Snyder explores freedom in a new book, Freedom for Ukraine and throughout the West, and especially here in the United States.
In our country, we think about freedom in a too limited way.
Professor Snyder titled his 2017 bestseller On Tyranny. He calls this new book On Freedom.
The whole idea we have that if the government leaves us alone, we're free. Unfortunately, that goes directly back to slavery. That's a plantation idea because only the government can free the slaves. It's not just an intellectual error. It's a historical taint. You can't be free by yourself. You have to let other people in, and you have to acknowledge that other people are people like yourself.
I want to get you to talk about one of your earliest, clearest memories of freedom. You were, I guess it was 1976. You were 6 years old. There was a bell on your family's farm in Ohio.
That was, of course, the summer of the bicentennial, and all the symbolism of it really impressed my 6-year-old mind. When I was lining up with my cousins and my brothers to ring the bell on the family farm, even at 6, I was thinking about the Liberty Bell, putting it all together. freedom as a kind of declaration, let freedom ring. But that memory is meant to show both the power and the limits of how we think about freedom. Because, of course, freedom is something that you declare, but where did that bell come from? Somebody had to forge it. My grandfather had to bring it from a different place. Where did the farm come from? Where did the lane that led to the farm come from, and the road that led to the lane? A lot of work had to go in to create that situation so that I could think about freedom.
You're joining us from Ukraine. What draws you there? What have you learned about freedom there?
I'm hoping that you can't hear the air raid sirens in the background. Yes, I'm in Ukraine now, and what drew me to it is that I'm a historian of Eastern Europe, but during this war, I felt like it would only be honest of me to check what I thought against what Ukrainians thought. The first time I went to Ukraine after the war started in 2022, I realized that everybody I talked to was talking about freedom. As their cities were threatened, as many of them were refugees, as people were defending themselves desperately in those early months. And that helped me think about freedom as character. We sometimes think of freedom as impulse. You're just doing exactly what you feel like at a given moment and you're free. I think that freedom is the moral choices that you make. And in Ukraine, that was brought home to me by the president, Zelensky, who chose to stay during the invasion. And he, of course, was leading a nation of people who chose to stay and resist at a time when we in America thought that their country would fall in 3 days. So that was important to me as well, that freedom is also that you know what you have to do because you know who you are.
You warn about what you see as the politics of and leaders of inevitability. What is that?
It's a story we tell ourselves. We imagine that because somebody rang the Liberty Bell or because somebody got together and wrote a constitution or because we're exceptional, because there's capitalism, we imagine that freedom is getting taken care of for us. And this is a story that I think was particularly powerful in America after communism came to an end. And we got ourselves thinking, well, okay, so long as we just have the right economic system, then we will be free. And this is a huge mistake. Sorry if my voice is wavering a bit, but this is actually a rocket, which means I actually have.
Professor Snyder? Professor Snyder, can you hear us? My gosh. Are you there, Professor? Let me ask our producer, Andrew Craig. Is the line still open, Andrew? Yes? Our line is still open, so we're going to stay with him and hope for the safety of all around. Professor Snyder?
Hi there. Sorry, I lost you. I had to walk out of Wi-Fi range.
Mm-hmm. May we ask what happened?
The Russians fired a rocket at Kiev, and Ukrainian air defense shot it down. The rockets are very fast, and so you actually do have to. You can't really mess around. But they shot it down with a Patriot, so everything's fine.
All right, you're all right?
Yeah. I'm absolutely fine.
You've been very affected by what Ukrainians have told you, haven't you?
Well, yeah, but not in the obvious ways. They don't just mean being free of something bad. They seem to mean getting through the terrible things that they're facing now into a world where they'll have a lot of possible beautiful futures. Just getting the other army out isn't enough to make somebody free. If their house is in ruins or, if they're an older person and they can't make their way to the road or there's no bus service, physical things like that can make you unfree too.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you also have to think, what are the good things that you need so that older people could actually be free or so that kids could be free? Ukrainians are sad when their playgrounds are destroyed. Kids need these things to grow up to become the kinds of people who can be free.
I'd like to end this interview by going back to your family farm in Ohio, because you write later in the book that you saw your 11-year-old son ring that same bell you did in 1976, joined by one of his friends. What did you see, and what did you see in that scene?
There were a lot of things for me in the world that were dreamy in 1976, and I had chances to become a free person. My family and my friends and various kinds of good fortune and various kinds of institutions which were built out. I mean, to be free, you have to get together and do work, which is collective, but which is also generational, which is for the people, for the Americans yet to come. And if you break that generational link, then you're not a free country, right? You're not a land of the free. So I ended the scene with my son because my son was there with a friend. It's meant to be a hopeful ending.
The two young men rang the bell together.
They did, and then they ran off down the lane and did something else.
Ringing the bell and then hearing the sound of their footsteps running off down the lane, kind of the sound of freedom to you now?
You never get to the end of that road. I do like to think that we've made a few steps forward and we can see the way forward a little bit better.
Timothy Snyder, Yale historian, his new book on freedom. Thank you so much for being with us. Good luck to everybody with you there.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. Let us know what you think. You can write to us at bookoftheday@npr.org. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Chloe Weiner and edited by Sierra Crawford, Yolanda Sanguini, and Beth Donovan, who is also our managing editor. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Jeanette Woods, Elena Burnett, Todd Muntz, Julia Corcoran, Christopher Intagliata, Melissa Gray, Samantha Balaban, Karen Miller-Medson, Mark Navin, Andrew Craig, and Ed McNulty. Thanks for listening.
Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Learning. IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid no matter the age or personality. Get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when you sign up today at IXL.com/NPR.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR.